Hello everyone, I'm Chris, and welcome to Dark Horror Diaries. If you've ever been home alone and felt a cold breath on your neck, or if you've ever caught your neighbor standing motionless just staring at your house, this episode is for you. Tonight, we are dropping you straight into 3 terrifying scenarios of isolation, surveillance, and the sheer terror of being caught alone in the dark. Lock your doors now. Let's get started. I catalog the dead for a living, not in the poetic sense but the municipal one, scanning barcodes on evidence bags in the sub-basement of the county record building where time goes to rust. My name is Daniel Price, 38, divorced, methodical, and driven by an uncomfortable need to prove that chaos can be sorted into labeled boxes. On the night everything began to fracture, I was awake at 2:11 a.m. in my narrow rental house on Hillcrest Lane, reheating leftover noodles and listening to a police scanner app on my phone, hearing the operator's calm voice line up new disasters in tidy rows. That was when the laughter slipped through the vents, light, childish, close. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth, listening as the sound drifted again, a faint giggle followed by a shushing whisper. I whispered into the empty kitchen, "Hello," feeling ridiculous the second the word left my mouth, then not ridiculous at all when the laughter answered. Hillcrest Lane has old houses that creak for reasons no one remembers anymore, and my place was no exception, a compact cedar-sided single-story with a crawlspace foundation and a surprise basement the landlord had claimed was sealed and unused. I told myself it was just air moving through metal or the neighbor's television bleeding through the ducts, even though my nearest neighbor was a retired man who went to bed at 8 and hated children. Still, the laughter came again the next night, and the next, always after midnight, always distant but unmistakable. At work I found myself scrubbing the same file again and again without remembering doing it, replaying the sound in my head. During a lunch break my coworker Lila asked, "You look like you are waiting for something bad to happen." I told her, "I think there are kids in my house." She smiled thinly and said, "Then move out before they grow hot." My motivations have always been embarrassingly simple. I want silence when I ask for it, and order where it can be made. After my divorce, I downsized my life until it fit into 17 boxes and one bookshelf. The house at Hillcrest represented a line under the mess of my past, one monthly payment at a time. The laughter felt like a hand reaching under that line. On the 4th night, I followed the sound instead of retreating from it. It led me to the hallway vent across from the bathroom, the laughter now close enough that I could hear breath between giggles. I pressed my ear to the brushed metal grill and said, "This is not funny." The laughter stopped. For a full minute the house ticked inside, alone again, until something tapped once from the other side of the wall, a polite, deliberate knock that was not part of any heating system I had ever known. Sleep left me in pieces after that. I began coming home earlier to prove to myself that the house was still a house and not a container for whatever heard me speak through the vents. I checked locks twice, then 3 times, standing in the living room with the lights off, listening to the dark. On the 6th night I heard footsteps under me, slow and measured, moving where no footsteps should be able to move. I dropped to my knees and pressed my palm to the floor, whispering, "Stop." The footsteps stopped. In the records office the next day, I misplaced 2 entire boxes of archived tapes before realizing my hands were shaking. Lila asked if I was sick. I said, "I think someone is living under my house." She said, "Then call the police." I did not. Cataloging the dead has taught me how often urgency is a costume fear likes to wear. The house began to feel staged, like a set constructed just for me. Objects were where I left them, but they felt observed. I started placing small tests for the unseen, a chair angled just so, a book with a folded corner. Each morning they were unchanged, which frightened me more than if they had moved. The laughter returned on the 8th night louder than before, bouncing through the vents with a playful cruelty. This time I heard more than one voice. I stood in the hallway with a flashlight and said, "You are in my house." A child's voice answered softly through the duct, "We know." I backed into the living room and locked the hall door like that piece of pressed wood could protect me from sound. My job taught me how to open sealed containers without damaging what is inside. On the 9th day, I went to the hardware store and bought a drill, a pry bar, and 2 flashlights. The landlord had lied when he said there was no basement access. There was a square panel in the utility closet behind the water heater, painted the same off-white as the wall but bordered by smudges where other hands had worried at it before mine. I called Lila before I opened it and told her where I was and what I was doing. She said, "If you do not call me back in 10 minutes, I am calling someone for you." I said, "Deal like this was a game." I pried the panel loose and the smell of old dust and cold iron breathed out at me like a held sigh. The ladder below the panel was steeper than it had any right to be, the rungs cold and slick under my palms. My flashlight beam cut into a narrow shaft and found poured concrete walls sweating with age. The laughter was so close now that I could hear the quick inhale between each sound. When my shoes touched the basement floor, the beam caught a metal table, a folding chair, and against the far wall a tall object draped in a plastic sheet. On the wall beside it, taped in a careful line, were white labels marked in black ink. Nights 1, Nights 2, Nights 3. The numbers climbed with methodical patience until they reached Night 17. My phone vibrated in my pocket with Leela's text. "You still alive?" I typed back. "Found something. Going to look." Then I pulled the plastic sheet away and met the glass eye of a film projector pointed directly at the ladder behind me. I backed up until my shoulder blades pressed into concrete, trying to turn the sight of the thing into a fact I could file and store. The projector was old, real old, the kind with a heavy metal body and a manual rewind crank, its lens polished clean like it was used often. The laughter stopped the instant I touched it. The silence felt rehearsed. I told the empty room, "I am calling the police," even and I knew I was lying. The truth was that a darker curiosity had already set its hooks in me, the same instinct that made me open unlabeled boxes at work just to see what someone had tried to hide. I reached for the nearest reel, its white disc warm from recent handling, and read the ink along its edge. Nights 1. My hand shook as I fed it onto the spindle, the beam of the projector slicing into the dark as it came to life. And somewhere above me in the house, a child laughed again. The projector coughed to life with a dry, mechanical whir that sounded like an old man clearing his throat before a confession. Dust motes swarmed in the beam, turning the darkness into a slow snowfall. The first image flickered onto the concrete wall across from me, warped at the corners, tinted in sickly yellow. It was my front porch. My porch light was off. I recognized the crack in the third step, the spider plant I kept forgetting to throw away. The timestamp in the corner read 11:06 p.m., and the date was from almost 3 weeks earlier, 2 days after I had moved in. I was not on the porch. The camera was positioned at chest height, steady, patient, like someone standing very still in the shadow across the street. I felt a creeping pressure behind my eyes as the scene continued in silence for several minutes, nothing happening at all until the front door opened and I stepped out carrying 2 overflowing trash bags. I watched myself struggle with the door using my shoulder, swear when the bag ripped, and laugh at my own clumsiness. The sound did not come through the projector. All I saw was my mouth move in a silent imitation of myself, unaware of the attention I was already receiving. I did not breathe again until the image cut to static. The next shot showed the side of the house, then the backyard, then my living room window with the lights off, all from the outside. All framed like someone who understood patience better than I ever had. My stomach turned over on itself with a slow, deliberate roll. I slapped the projector off and the basement dropped back into darkness so deep it felt liquid. I stood there blind for several seconds, flashlight forgotten in my hand, trying to convince myself that a stranger filming from the street was unsettling but not impossible. People filmed houses. People did strange things for reasons that often made sense once you found the receipt. I told myself this was a prank. A sick one, yes, but still a prank. When I turned the projector back on, my hands moved with the confidence of someone determined to own the decision that followed. The second reel showed the first interior angle. The camera hovered in the corner of my living room near the ceiling, tucked above the smoke detector where I had never once thought to look. I watched myself that first week eating takeout on the couch, scrolling through my phone, kicking off my shoes with the same tired routine I still followed. The worst part was not seeing myself tracked like an animal. It was seeing how predictable I looked. I knew exactly what I would do next in every scene. I could turn my head before I did. On the fourth reel, the angle shifted into my bedroom. The camera was mounted somewhere behind the vent grill, the footage cut directly to me asleep. The timestamp read 2:10 a.m. I felt my jaw lock as I watched my chest rise and fall. In the background, barely visible at first, a darker shape stood just inside the doorframe. It did not move. It did not need to. Its presence pressed against the back of my neck like a held breath. I jumped when my phone rang in my pocket. I fumbled it out with stiff fingers and saw Lila's name on the screen. I answered without looking away from the frozen image on the wall. "I am not imagining it," I said before she could speak. "Someone has been in my bedroom." She asked, "Are you safe right now?" Each word separate and careful. I whispered, "I am in the basement. There is film of me sleeping." I heard her inhale sharply, and then she was all motion and command. "You need to leave the house. Now. Go to your car and call the police from there." I told her I would. I did not move. My eyes kept searching the shadow in the doorway of the frame, the faint suggestion of a human outline that refused to confirm itself. When the footage resumed, the shadow was gone. The reel ended seconds later. Silence folded over the basement again like a sheet pulled tight. I should have run. That is the part that makes the most sense when people tell this story later. What I did instead was load Nights 5. There is a special kind of shame attached to curiosity when it wears the mask of necessity. I told myself I needed to understand the scope. The next reels followed the same pattern with slight, terrible variations. Angles closer to my windows, positioning inside different rooms. My routines became chapters of a private anatomy. I saw myself pacing during a phone argument with my ex-wife that I barely remembered now, my hands moving in the exact same frustrated shapes I had made years before while packing boxes. I saw myself sit at the kitchen table at 1:30 a.m. on a Thursday and drink directly from the milk carton while reading a case file I had smuggled home out of misplaced diligence. On night 7, the camera had been inside the utility closet with the hiding place I had just discovered, looking out at me as I searched for a flashlight days earlier, my face tight with the confusion I now understood too well. By night 9, the background figure returned. This time it was impossible to deny. It stood at the far edge of the frame near the bedroom door, half-washed in gray light from the hall. The shape wore a smooth, pale mask that reflected just enough glare to make it the only feature that mattered. It tilted its head slightly, like someone trying to remember a face they already knew too well. I felt my legs threaten to give out and forced myself into the folding chair in front of the projector. My heart hammered so hard my vision pulsed with it. I could see no eyes through the mask, no mouth, just a blank, curved surface trained directly on me as I slept. I whispered, "What do you want?" to the concrete wall and to the memory of a presence that had already proven it did not need my permission to watch. By the time the projector reached Nights 1 I understood the meaning of the children's laughter. The audio track finally kicked in on one of the reels with a hiss of static that made my skin prickle. The sound was faint at first, like a radio in another room. Then a girl's voice drifted through the basement speakers. Again she said, delighted. A boy laughed softly as if coached to keep it down. The sounds did not match any movement on screen. They existed as a layer over my sleeping body, disembodied and eager. It was a performance for an audience I could not see. I remembered the way the laughter had traveled through my vents, how it seemed to move room to room with intention, and a cold logic slid into place. The sounds were being played to me, practiced, repeated until I learned to recognize them the way I now recognized myself off film. I was not just being recorded, I was being conditioned. I do not know how many reels I watched in a row after that. Time melted into a smear of images and anticipation and dread. The masked figure appeared in every subsequent night with a precision that felt ceremonial. Each time it stood closer. In the earliest it was near the door, By night 17, it hovered at the foot of my bed close enough that I could see the faint seam along the edge of the mask. By night 16, it leaned down as if to listen to my breathing. I found myself involuntarily matching the rhythm in my chest, as if by syncing with the past I might influence the present. I began talking to the screen like a fool, warns to myself that could not pass the barrier of recorded time. "Do not sleep," I told him. "Do not stay here." My phone buzzed again with Lila calling back after I had missed her last 3 attempts. I finally answered and said, "It is getting closer every night." Her voice broke on the word closer. The last reel of the rack was heavier than the others, its label inked with a steadiness that made me angry for reasons I could not yet name. Nights 17. My hands refused to lift it at first. The projector's light burned against the wall, showing the faint ghost of the last image like a bruise that would not fade. I stood there in the beam with the reel at my feet and felt the enormous, childish urge to shove it under the table and pretend it did not exist. I thought of the children's voices. I thought of the empty mask reflecting my own face back at me as I slept. Somewhere above me, in the house that no longer felt like mine, a soft laugh slipped into the ducts again, closer than it had ever been. I left the reel on the table. I climbed the ladder with my hands shaking hard enough that metal rang. When I reached the utility closet, I did not close the panel. I could not stand the idea of sealing that room while what it contained had already learned the shape of me. I slept in my car that night in the grocery store parking lot under a floodlight that hummed with insects. I did not dream. In the morning, I quit my job by voicemail. I told the landlord I was breaking the lease effective immediately. Leela drove out to meet me with 2 coffees and a face she kept carefully blank. We sat on the curb while I told her about the projector, the reels, the closer and closer mask. When I finished, she said, "You know this means the person is still coming back." I nodded. The last reel was not played. She stared at me for a long time and then asked the question I had been avoiding since the first image lit up the basement wall. "Daniel, do you know if any of the footage shows what happens after she steps out of the frame?" I did not answer. I was already standing up, keys in my hand, my eyes fixed to the quiet line of my own roof against the pale morning sky. We did not go back into the house right away. Leela insisted on stopping at her apartment first so I could sit somewhere that did not smell like mildew and old wood. I showered using her soap and her towels, scrubbing until my skin felt raw, as if the camera's gaze might peel off with enough effort. I borrowed a change of her clothes that hung awkwardly on my frame and sat at her small kitchen table while she paced. "We need the police," she said for the 10th time. "Not later." Now I stared into my coffee until it went untouched and cold. "If I call them before we play night 17, they take the reels," I said. "Evidence," she replied. "Yes," I said, "and the only map I have of what is coming." She stopped pacing and searched my face. "You sound like someone who thinks this is already written." I did not have an answer that felt honest enough to speak out loud. By midday, I was back on Hillcrest Lane with Leela parked a block away, phone in her hand like a talisman. The house looked ordinary in the bright light, my porch steps harmless, my windows reflective and empty. Before I went inside, I stood on the sidewalk and turned in a slow circle, scanning rooftops, tree lines, parked cars. Nothing moved that should not have been moving. It struck me then how carefully invisible the watcher had been, how unremarkable the vantage points must have appeared to anyone else. The front door felt like it weighed twice what it had the night before. Inside, the air was quiet and false again, silence laid flat like a trap. The utility closet panel still hung open. I took the ladder down as if returning to a job I had left unfinished, every rung a count I did not want to complete. The projector still faced the wall with the patience of a loaded question. The reels rested where I had left them, lined with perfect obedience. I lifted night 17 and felt a faint heat in the metal rim that might have been my imagination or something far worse. My hands shook harder than they had before, and I laughed once under my breath at the sound of myself. "Of course you shake," I muttered. "This is what shaking is for." I fed the reel into place and sat in the folding chair like a witness taking the stand. The beam flared white and then resolved into the familiar warped square of my bedroom. The timestamp was from the night before, the night I had fled to the parking lot under the floodlight, The bed on the screen was empty. The camera angle was closer than ever. It hung low and tight on the doorway, giving the room a narrow, claustrophobic depth. For nearly 5 minutes, nothing happened. The image held steady on the empty bed, the rumpled sheets a quiet record of my last sleep in that room. I began to realize the most efficient way to frighten someone is to let them inventory everything that is missing. I leaned forward without meaning to, my knees pressed to the edge of the table. Then the masked figure slid slowly into the frame. It did not step. It drifted, the motion smooth and deliberate as if guided on a track. It stopped at the foot of the bed where it had hovered before. I waited for the tilt of the head, the lean toward where my breathing used to be. It did not come. The mask faced the camera directly. Faced me. The audio crackled to life. The familiar children's laughter rose, louder than it had ever been through the vents. Somewhere behind that layer of sound, a woman spoke softly, almost tender. "Empty," she said. Then the reel jerked into static. I stumbled out of the chair as if punched in the chest. The word empty rang in my ears with the slow echo of a dropped coin. She had come back. She had stood at the foot of my bed and found only sheets and shadow. The implications ricocheted through my skull in a collision of fear and fierce, irrational relief. I was not there, but she had been close enough to see the shape my absence left behind. The thought that she had missed me by hours, maybe minutes, pressed against my lungs until I had to brace my hands on the table to breathe again. My phone was slick in my grip when I called Leela. "She came back," I said. "Last night." The bed was empty. Her answer came out steady but sharp. "Then she will come again." I did not argue with that because it felt like a simple fact. The police came an hour later, 3 of them at first. Then more as the weight of what they were seeing began to propagate through the chain of command. I watched from the basement steps as they cataloged my secret room with a professional detachment that did nothing to dull the meaning of it. The projector, the reels, the chair, the table. A forensic photographer leaned in so close to the mask on one of the frames still glowing on the wall that his nose nearly brushed the concrete. A detective with tired eyes and a voice that had lost the illusion of surprise asked me to explain the children's laughter. When I told him about the vents, his mouth flattened into a line. "We have audio on some unsolved cases that matches that," he said. "Spoofed, looped," he added when he saw my face. "Used to distract occupants. Keeps them thinking there are more than one." My throat went dry. "Are there?" I asked. He did not answer right away. The woman they eventually identified did not have a name I recognized. She had used several. She had a file a foot thick by the time the afternoon ended, her face revealed in grainy stills pulled from traffic cameras and gas station footage, her movements a patchwork pattern of near misses and overlooked connections. They called her a recreational archivist in 9-press summary, a phrase so clean it made my stomach twist. The detective told me she had followed a consistent ritual. She selected a subject, recorded them for a minimum of 2 weeks from both outside and inside their home, added a manufactured sound layer to disorient and test responses, and only then made contact. The filing system aspect of it all did not escape me. "To memorize them," I said. The tired detective shifted his weight. "That is what we think," he replied. "We have 11 confirmed victims. All of them have some form of recorded archive recovered after the fact." After the fact rang louder than anything else he said. They searched the surrounding blocks. They brought dogs. They found nothing that first night except more evidence of proximity than I could stand to process. On a rooftop 2 houses down, they found scuff marks that matched the soles of shoes recovered from one of the known crime scenes. In my backyard, near the fence, they recovered a small plastic speaker wired to a cheap transmitter. When an officer lifted it, the children's laughter spilled out at low volume as if embarrassed to be heard. Lila stood with her hands over her mouth and cried without sound until another officer guided her gently away. I felt emptied out by then, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Everything that had happened to me had happened while I was unconscious or somewhere else. It left me with the disorienting sense that the most important passages of my life were now being written in a language I did not speak. They cleared the house before sunset and posted a unit on the street for the night. The detective advised me not to stay. I told him I was not sure I could ever leave. That earned me a long look that I returned without flinching. "She learned my shape here," I said. "If she comes again, this is where she comes." He did not tell me that was foolish. He only said, "Then we will be waiting." Lila argued with me in the driveway under the soft wash of the cruiser lights. "You do not owe this house anything," she said. "You do not owe her anything," I said. "I owe myself the truth of how this ends." That confession surprised both of us. The waiting began that night. The police kept quiet, unmarked positions. Lila sat with me in the living room with the lamps off and the television muted, her car idling across the street as a visible alibi she could return to at any second. Hour after hour went by with nothing but the refrigerator's steady hum and the low murmur of a radio from somewhere outside. My nerves stretched thin and then thinner until the smallest noises felt enormous. Close to 2 a.m, the vent in the hallway whispered alive. The laugh came soft at first, like it was being tried out again after a long time in storage. Lila's eyes locked on mine in the dark. The sound slid down the ductwork toward us. A gentle shuffle of metal followed, the suggestion of movement within the walls. I held up one finger to her and reached for the phone on the coffee table with my other hand, my pulse loud enough that I thought it might leak out through my skin. The laughter stopped. The sudden silence felt like pressure lifting and then returning doubled. From the backyard came the faint click of something touching the fence. One of the officers' radios crackled, too loud in the quiet, and then cut off. I stood without meaning to. Lila's hand caught in my sleeve. "Do not," she whispered. I obeyed because fear finally outweighed everything else in that moment. A shadow passed across the narrow gap under the back door. The doorknob turned with slow, patient care. It did not open. A quiet disappointment seemed to radiate from the other side, almost polite. The shadow withdrew. The house breathed again. They never caught her that night. When dawn came, pale and anticlimactic, the police lifted the perimeter and promised more units, more watching, more eyes. I nodded and said the right things while my mind replayed the way the lock had held under that measured turn. The detective told me she had approached the backyard cameras from the one blind angle they had not managed to cover. I told him I already knew that kind of precision was her language. By the time the house was quiet again and the officers were gone, the idea that she had been so close I could hear the metal turn under her hand made my hand shake all over again, harder than before. Lila drove me to a hotel against my protests, and I let myself be moved like furniture because I did not trust my judgment anymore. In the sterile safety of that room, with its unfamiliar bed and predictable beige decor, the last reel played on a loop in my mind. Empty. The word shifted its meaning each time I turned it over. Empty as in gone, empty as in promised, empty as in waiting to be filled again. I stared at the ceiling for hours and realized with a slow, grim clarity that the archive she had built on me was now incomplete. She had memorized me up to the point of my absence. That left a gap in her record, a flaw in the story she was telling herself about who I was and how I would die. I understood then what I had not dared to understand in the basement. I was not finished being recorded. The hotel room became my temporary bunker, a square of borrowed safety where every sound felt too loud, because it was not the right sound. I spent the first day pacing between the bed and the window, watching the parking lot as if she might step out from between the identical sedans, with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed the moment. Lila sat in the plastic chair by the door with her laptop open, fielding calls from the detective and forwarding updates I could not bear to hear directly. "They are tracing the transmitter signal from the speaker," she told me. "It hops through short-range relays. Cheap tech, but clever placement." I replied, "Cheap is enough if you understand habits." I did not tell her that I had begun mapping my own patterns in the hotel stationery. When I ate, when I slept, when I checked the locks. I needed to see where the gaps still were. My phone buzzed with an unknown number just after sunset. I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later it buzzed again with a text that contained nothing but a single word: empty. I showed Lila without speaking, her face drained of color with a speed that made me feel suddenly responsible for the room itself. The police confirmed the message did not originate from any number they recognized as tied to the case, which in their language meant everything and nothing at once. They increased the patrol around the hotel and advised me again to relocate. I refused, with a stubbornness that surprised even me. The truth was not brave. The truth was that the idea of moving again felt like erasing the evidence of myself she had worked so carefully to collect. That night the laughter did not come through any vent. It came through my phone. A soft audio file arrived just before midnight. I did not have to open it to know what it would contain. Lila grabbed my wrist when I reached for the screen. "Do not give her that," she said. I pulled free and listened anyway. The children laughed quietly, as if in a bedroom down the hall. Beneath it, almost lost, I could hear my own voice from some past night, murmuring in sleep. When the file ended, there was no message attached. The implication landed with crushing clarity. The archive was still growing, the gap was closing. The next morning the detective called with news that finally pierced the drifting unreality of the past 2 days. "We found another setup," he said, "not active yet, but it matches the pattern." I asked where. He paused before answering. 2 miles from your house," he said. "Empty rental, similar age, similar layout." My chest tightened with a strange mixture of relief and insult. "So I am not special," I said. The detective answered, "You never were. You were next." That blunt sentence did more to steady me than any reassurance could have. It reduced my terror to scale. I asked if they had eyes of the place. He said they did. I asked if they had tried bait. He inhaled and said they were discussing it. That was the moment I realized how different my priorities had become. "Use me," I said without thinking. The silence of the line stretched long enough that I almost retracted the words. Then he said, "We cannot ask you to do that." I replied, "You did not." I volunteered. When I ended the call, Lila was staring at me as if seeing a stranger wearing my face. We argued in low, fierce voices until our words wore grooves in the air between us.
"You want to turn yourself into a lure," she said. "You catalog the dead for a living and now you want to join them."
I told her the truth I had been circling for days. She memorizes. That is her pattern. She will not move on until the record is complete. If I disappear into protective custody and live quietly for the rest of my life, she still owns the version of me that sleeps unaware. I cannot live as an unfinished reel. The way that sentence sounded coming out of my mouth frightened me, but it felt true in a way few things had before. Lila's voice broke when she said my name. I touched her shoulder and felt the tremor there like a second heartbeat. "I do not want to die," I said. "I want to interrupt the ritual." She shook her head slowly. "Rituals are older than reason," she said. "They do not like to be interrupted," I answered. "Then maybe they can learn to be." By afternoon, the plan had taken a shape that felt both insane and inevitable. I would return to my house under the pretense of giving a formal statement on site. The police would stage a visible perimeter that could be studied and logged by any watcher with patience. They would not, however, reveal the changes in the basement. The projector would be set as if waiting. One reel would be left on the table, unlabeled. Night Nights 18. Not anything that invited the neat arithmetic she preferred. Just blank possibility. If she returned to finish what she had begun, the hope was that she would go where the archive lived. The detective made no promises. I made none either. Before we left the hotel, Lila held my face between her hands and said, "If this goes wrong, I will never forgive you." I told her softly, "If it goes right, you will still be angry." We shared a thin smile that did not quite reach either of us. The house at Hillcrest did not feel surprised to see me again. It felt expectant. The police moved with careful boredom, leaning on cruisers, smoking, the visible language of waiting for nothing to happen. Inside, the rooms were exactly as I had left them, which meant they were full of her attention. Every object felt like a prop. I went straight to the basement and stood at the bottom of the ladder with the lights off, while the detective adjusted the projector. The blank reel waited on the table like a dare. "If she comes," he said quietly, "do not play hero." I nodded because that was the part of the instruction I was least likely to follow. When he left, sealing the panel behind him from the inside so it would appear untouched from above, the house regained its deeper, more private silence. I climbed the ladder and left the panel ajar the way I had before. The decision felt like stepping out of cover. Night thickened around the house with slow determination. I sat in the living room with one lamp on and the television playing a muted documentary I could not see, only sense as shifting light. I spoke aloud to fill the space because silence had learned my shape too well. I described the room as if to a listener who had never been here before. Brown couch, scratch on the left arm, coffee table with one broken caster, door that sticks in summer. I felt foolish and focused at the same time. At 47 a.m., the hall vent whispered. The laughter followed immediately, louder than it had ever been inside this house, the sound of it bouncing sharply off surfaces instead of drifting. Someone was close. The laughter stopped as if at a signal. From the utility closet came the faint scrape of the panel shifting. I stood slowly and said into the room, "You missed me." The words felt weighted, as if they had been waiting for the right air. A soft footstep answered from beyond the closet door, placed with care and confidence. I backed toward the basement stairs without taking my eyes off that narrow, ordinary rectangle of wood. "You left the room empty?" she said from the other side in a voice that matched the recording's tenderness exactly. That is not how the story was supposed to go. I felt my pulse in my temples like a second timepiece, each beat a marker I could lose count of at any second. "Stories change," I said. "You taught me that." The handle turned. I retreated step by measured step down into the basement, letting the darkness swallow me in layers. I heard her follow with unhurried certainty, the ritual resuming at last. When my foot met concrete, I reached for the projector switch without looking back. The beam flared to life behind me as her shadow reached the bottom of the stairs and spilled long across the floor, finally stepping out of the frame she had practiced for so long. The basement felt smaller with her in it, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. The projector's beam cut a white rectangle across the concrete and caught the curve of her mask as she stepped fully into the light. Up close, the mask was not smooth perfection as it had appeared on film. It was scored with hairline scratches, a history of mere touches and careless storage. The seam along its edge was uneven, hurried in places. She wore dark clothes that swallowed the beam where it did not strike the mask, and her hands were bare, relaxed at her sides. No weapon was visible. That detail unnerved me more than a blade would have. "You ruined the rhythm," she said calmly. 2 weeks was always enough. You changed the ending by leaving." I kept my back to the table and my eyes at the hard oval of her face. "You were the one who came back to an empty bed," I said. "That seems like a problem for you, not me." She tilted her head the way she had in the recordings, and I felt the old, involuntary echo of that motion in my own muscles. "All records resist erasure," she replied. "They want to be whole." She took a step closer. The shadow of her body slid along the floor and met my shoes. The children's laughter began to play again from somewhere I could not yet locate, soft but insistent, as if cued by her proximity. I lifted my foot and knocked the folding chair aside with a clatter that sounded too loud in the sudden quiet between laughs. "They are not children, are they?" I said. "They are just echoes you drag behind you." She considered that as if it were a technical question. "They were once," she answered. "They learned very quickly." My thoughts fractured into sharp, practical pieces that felt nothing like terror. The pipe leaned against the wall behind the table where the detective had left it, a blunt length of corroded metal meant to look like debris. I could not reach it without crossing the cone of the projector light and turning my back on her. I told myself that the moment she lunged, I would not have the luxury of planning anymore. "Why me?" I asked suddenly. The question surprised us both. It sounded small in the big room. "You were ordinary," she said with a trace of irritation. You stayed ordinary, you did not reshuffle your shape when you were seen. That makes the archive clean. That was the core of it. Note fascination, not anger, clarity. The idea pressed against something old in me. I had spent years sorting chaos into labels because it made the world legible. She had simply chosen a darker room to work in. The laughter looped and looped, rising and falling with no one's breath. I tried to triangulate it by ear and failed. The sound filled the basement like fog. "You are not alone in the house," I said, making the accusation a test. She smiled behind the mask in a way I could hear in her voice. "Everyone is alone when it matters," she said. "But if it comforts you, the instruments are placed with care." Instruments. The word struck with cold accuracy. I thought of the speaker found in my yard, the relays hopscotching the sound closer and closer to me, the way the laughter had moved with purpose. "You wanted to see if I would come down here," I said. "If I would follow the sound." "You did," she replied. "You always do what the record predicts." That flared a vein of anger I had not yet allowed myself to touch. "You missed done prediction," I said. "You predicted I would stay asleep." She did not answer right away. The beam of the projector flickered as if reacting to my heartbeat instead of the electrical current. In that arrested moment I saw the faintest movement in the far corner, a shift in shadow that did not match the steady geometry of the room. A second presence existed just at the edge of my vision. The realization that she was not truly alone made my scalp prickle. "How many of you are they?" I asked. "How many sets of hands?" she said lightly. "Enough to keep the system running." Before I could press further, the laughter cut off mid-note as if a switch had been thrown with finality. The sudden silence brought every scrape of fabric and her slow inhale into sharp relief. "The archive is behind schedule," she said. "This is the part where you return to the bed. We correct the ending." I took a step sideways toward the table, keeping my eyes level. The unlabeled reel gleamed dully under the projector's spill. "You cannot correct a story by killing its author," I said, without knowing where the words had come from. She laughed once, a private sound that did not echo the children. "You mistake yourself for the author when you have only ever been the subject," she said. She moved then, not in a rush, but with a smooth decisiveness that ate the space between us faster than I could measure. I twisted and brought my forearm up out of reflex as she struck, her blow a compact impact that rattled my teeth and sent me stumbling into the table. The blank reel clattered to the floor and spun on its edge. Stars flashed across my vision as pain sketched its bright, blunt map along my arm. We circled each other in the shallow cone of light, our feet whispering over dust. I caught a flash of motion again at the far wall, the same half shape as before, and understood with a numb clarity that she had not lied. The instruments were placed with care. She lunged again, faster this time, and I ducked under her reach, feeling the rush of air as her fingers passed where my throat had been. I fell against the table and found the edge of the projector with my hip. The machine swayed. The beam skated wildly across the basement for a breathless second before settling again. "You should not move the eye," she snapped, a rare thread of irritation fraying her calm. That flicker of emotion steadied me more than any strategy. She had rules. She depended on her apparatus. That meant it could be used against her. My hand brushed the pipe as I staggered sideways, and I hooked it with desperate fingers, bringing it up in a clumsy arc that she evaded with a dancer's ease. The metal sang in my palms from the missed strike. "You learned my routines too well," I said through gritted teeth. "You forgot to learn what happens when they break." She advanced again, this time feinting toward my left and then stepping in close on my right. I felt a blunt impact in my ribs that folded the breath out of me in one rough parcel. I crashed into the ladder with a rattle that rang through the beams. Above us, the house whispered with the small settling noises of old wood, oblivious to the choreography below. She pressed in close enough that I could see the faint seam in the mask up close, see the slight unevenness where one eye hole sat a fraction lower than the other. "You were supposed to be still," she said softly. "They always are by now." I forced the pipe between us, its cold length a brief fence. "Your timing is off," I gasped. "You came back to fix it. That means you already lost control." The sentence landed with visible effect. Her grip tightened. In that instant, the shadow in the corner shifted again and resolved into a partial figure that stepped forward just enough to cast a second silhouette across the floor. My stomach dropped. A man's outline, thin and uncertain, as if unsure whether he existed. He did not speak. He did not need to. He was proof of process, proof that the archive consumed more than memory. I swung the pipe in a wide, unskilled arc meant not to strike her, but to strike the projector. The metal clipped its housing with a crunch that sent a shock through my arms and knocked the machine askew. The beam flared brighter and skidded across her mask for the briefest instant, a burst of concentrated light that made her recoil with a sharp cry. I saw for the first time that the mask was not just disguise, but protection, lined with something dark and mad, to drink in what it faced. I had been wrong to think the projector was only an eye. It was a weapon she had learned to stand across from safely. Now, it was unbalanced and wild. I did not give her time to recover. I lunged for the switch and hit it hard. The sudden blast of full light flooded the basement in an unfiltered surge that burned white across the concrete and the underside of the stairs. She screamed then, a raw, uncontrolled sound that stripped the ceremony from everything at once. She staggered back, one hand clawing at the mask, the other reaching blindly into the brightness. The man in the corner flinched and vanished into shadow again as if yanked back by a cord. The laughter cut off in a jarring silence that felt like the room had dropped out from under a sound that had always been there. I raised the pipe with both hands, every muscle screaming its complaint, and felt a terrible clarity lock into place. This was the space where the record could be altered, not by erasure but by interruption. "You should have stopped filming," I said hoarsely as she reeled against the wall, her sense of the room shattered by the light. Her face turned toward the sound of my voice with slow, searching confusion. The projector's beam caught the inside of the mask at an angle, and I saw for the first time what it had been hiding. The detail lodged in my mind with horrific precision. She tried to speak my name and failed, her voice reduced to a fractured rasp. I did not strike yet. Something in me needed to understand the shape of her vulnerability in the same way she had understood mine. "The archive ends when the subject refuses to perform," I said. "You built a machine that only works on the asleep." She swayed, hands trembling, blinded and furious in equal measure. The basement felt charged, stretched taut between what had been and what could still happen. The next movement would decide everything. The light held her in place the way fear had once held me in sleep, rooting her to the concrete with trembling certainty. She turned her head in small, searching increments, as if trying to remember where walls had been a moment before. The pipe felt impossibly heavy in my hands now that the moment had stretched open instead of snapping shut. I could hear my own breathing loud and uneven, every inhale a negotiation. "You see now," I said, though I did not know if she could see anything at all. "You built a world that only works in the dark," she answered, with a thin, broken laugh that did not carry the confidence of the others I had heard from her. "Darkness is only another kind of light," she said. The words sounded practiced, part of the story she told herself to keep the machine running. I took one step closer, careful not to break the line of the projector's beam across her face. The mask was half torn away under her clawing fingers, and what it revealed was not monstrous in any way that would make this easier. It was simply human. Older than I had expected, tired, furious that the rules had shifted without her consent. She lunged blindly in the wrong direction, her foot slipping on the fine dust that coated the floor. The movement spun her sideways and brought her shoulder hard into the concrete wall with a sound that traveled up my bones. The beam skimmed off her face for a fraction of a second and panic seized me with sharp hands. I swung the pipe on instinct more than intention, not at her head but at her legs, aiming to end the chase without ending her. The metal connected with a jolt that vibrated through my wrists and sent her sprawling. She struck the floor hard enough to drive the air from her lungs in a single ragged exhale. The mask slid fully free and clattered across the concrete until it rested against the leg of the table. Without it, she seemed smaller, less inevitable. But when she looked up at me with naked eyes full of purpose and hate, I understood with a cold clarity that disguise had never been her true protection. Distance had. "I will still finish it," she whispered, pushing herself upright with shaking arms. "With you or after you, the record always finds a way to close." The words struck with the weight of promise rather than threat. I saw in that instant the totality of what she had made, not just in my home but across years and rooms I would never enter. I saw the man in the shadows again in my mind, the quiet witness who had once been like me, folded into the process until he no longer occupied the center of his own life. "You do not get to write endings anymore," I said. Her mouth twisted into a smile that wavered and failed. She staggered toward the ladder, one hand groping along the wall for direction. The projector beam slid away from her as the machine began to shudder from the impact I had dealt it. The eye was losing its balance. When the light broke from her fully, she surged with surprising speed toward the stairs. The moment narrowed into a tunnel of motion and choice. If she reached the ladder, the night would open up around us again, and the careful distance she relied on would return like a loyal shield. I stepped into her path without thinking, the pipe rising between us like punctuation. She swung at me with a wild, desperate strength that clipped my cheek and filled my head with a burst of white. Pain flared and then receded into a steady throb. I drove forward with the pipe, this time with no pretense left in my aim. The impact landed higher than I had intended. I felt it more than heard it, a sudden, terrible finality passing through the metal and into my arms. She collapsed at my feet in a quiet, unceremonious way that felt wrong after so much ritual. The basement seemed to inhale and hold the breath it had been saving. I stood over her for a long time without moving, the pipe hanging uselessly at my side. The projector sputtered and went dark with a tired click, leaving only the dim basement bulb the police had installed earlier. Without the strong light, everything looked ordinary again. Concrete, table, ladder. The extraordinary had slipped away with the same efficiency it had always used to enter. I knelt finally and pressed 2 fingers to her neck like I had seen others do. There was nothing to count. The stillness was complete. In the corner where I had seen the other figure, the shadows lay flat and innocent again. No man emerged. No witness stepped forward. Whatever had been there belonged to memory now, not to the room. The first siren arrived within minutes, though it felt like a long season passed before I heard it. The door above burst open, and the basement filled with overlapping voices and beams of light that fractured the space into moving pieces. Someone took the pipe from my hand. Someone else caught me by the shoulders when my legs decided their work was finished. I answered questions I barely registered, nodding when words no longer felt reliable. The detective with the tired eyes met my gaze across the chaos and gave me a single, nearly invisible nod that held more weight than all the paperwork that would follow. As they lifted her onto a stretcher, the unlabeled reel lay on the floor where it had fallen, its blank center reflecting a small, steady circle of light from an officer's flashlight. For the first time since this began, the future was not already etched into plastic. They found the rest of the instruments in the days that followed. Speakers tucked into crawl spaces of other houses, cameras hidden in vents and behind fixtures, relays daisy-chained through abandoned sheds and storm drains. The man I had glimpsed in shadow was identified as one of her earliest subjects, broken slowly into an accomplice who handled the pieces she no longer touched herself. He was found alive in an empty storage unit, more frightened of forgetting her than of prison. The archive they recovered was vast. What the police chose to label and what they chose to leave unnamed felt like another, quieter kind of editing. When the detective told me they had matched her to every remaining unsolved case tied to the recordings, the word closure passed between us without either of us speaking it aloud. The house at Hillcrest Lane was sealed for months after, first as a crime scene and then as an object of faint local legend. I did not fight the landlord when the lease dissolved into apologies and legal language. I moved into a smaller apartment with windows that faced a brick wall and no crawl spaces beneath the floor. At night I slept with the lights off and the silence awe. It took time to teach my body that the absence of sound was not always bait. Lila checked on me with methodical care, never asking for what I did not offer. Sometimes we sat together without speaking at all, the quiet shared, this time by choice instead of design. When she finally asked me if I felt like myself again, I told her the truth. Not the version she filmed, I said, but maybe the one who left the bed on time. I returned to work in a different capacity, assisting with the digitization of old evidence for modern storage. I handled tapes with a respect that bordered on superstition now, aware of how much of a person could be trapped in 2 dimensions and sound. I learned the relief of erasure as well as the importance of record. Some nights I dreamed in static and light, the projector beam wandering across walls that would never settle. Other nights were simply dark and quiet and unremarkable in all the best ways. The idea that someone might be watching never fully left me, but it loosened its grip enough to become a caution instead of a paralysis. On the anniversary of the night it ended, Lila and I drove past the old house without stopping. The porch light was on for someone new, the steps repaired so that third crack no longer existed. I did not feel a proprietary ache at the sight. I felt something closer to relief. The archive had not followed me. What remains now is not a story of being hunted, but of choosing, in none small room under a house, to refuse the role assigned without permission. I was watched, I was memorized, and still I stepped out of the frame. I make my living proving other people wrong about their houses. Cracks are never curses. Knocks are always pipes. Shadows are wiring issues or bad angles or old wood settling after midnight. That was my rule when I took the job inspecting rural properties for insurance disputes. When my divorce finalized and my apartment lease ended on the same week, I bought the farmhouse because it was cheap and everyone else was afraid of it. I arrived with 1 suitcase, my tool bag, and the relief of isolation that only wide fields and distant tree lines can bring. The first night, I was still unpacking at 12:58 a.m., half asleep and irritated that the power flickered every time I ran the microwave. At 1 a.m. exactly, I looked up from the kitchen and saw the shadow for the first time. The staircase rose from the center hallway like a spine, narrow and steep, leading to a landing that turned left toward the bedrooms. The light above it had a weak yellow bulb I kept meaning to replace. Against that light, something stood where nothing should have been. It was tall, thin, and perfectly still. It blocked the glow without reflecting any detail. No face, no hands, no shape beyond a solid human outline. I remember saying out loud, "That is not how shadows work." My voice sounded strange in the empty house, too loud and too small at the same time. I took 1 step forward, then another, my mind listing causes as if that could drag reality back into order. Code on a rack, open door, optical overlap. With each step, the figure shrank. By the time I reached the bottom stair, it thinned into the drywall behind it and vanished as if it had never existed. I did not sleep much after that. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that went cold in my hands, staring at the stairs until sunrise leaked through the front windows and turned the house into something ordinary again. By morning, the fear had dulled into embarrassment. I told myself it was exhaustion and stress. I had driven 400 miles that day, argued with the internet company, and lifted furniture that should have required help. Anyone would see things under those conditions. At work, we talk about pareidolia all the time. The brain wants meaning even when none exists. Still, when I checked my watch later that day and saw 1:00 p.m., my chest tightened in a way I did not like. The second night it happened again. I set an alarm for 1:00 p.m. and positioned myself in the living room with all the lights off. The clock on my phone flipped to 1:00 a.m. with a soft digital click. At 1:01, the bulb above the landing dimmed just slightly, not enough to call a fault but enough to register. At 1:02, the shadow stood there as if it had been waiting its turn. I felt a strange mix of fear and annoyance. "You are new," I told it, as if I were addressing a faulty appliance. It did not move. I shouted, "Hello!" My voice climbed the stairs and fell back to me. At 1:07, the figure faded into the wall again with the same smooth certainty as the night before. On the third day, I called my coworker Danny and described exactly what I had seen. She laughed with the relief of someone sitting in a crowded office under fluorescent lights. "You bought a haunted farmhouse, man. That is on you," she said. I tried to keep my tone even, and I listed every variable I had already tested. Light angle, outside vehicles, passing clouds, dust, reflections. She listened, then softened. "Stress can do wild things to sleep," she said. "It sneaks into waking moments. I had a phase where I saw spiders that were not there." I looked at the stairs while I spoke to her and said, "This off keeps an appointment." By the fourth night, my curiosity was louder than my fear. I moved closer than I had before, slow and steady, counting steps with deliberate care. At 3 feet from the first stair, the shadow did not change. At 2 feet, nothing shifted. I could feel the heat from the overhead bulb on my face, but the presence on the landing absorbed no light at all. I reached out with one hand, fingers spread, and said, "If you are something, prove it." That was when it pulled itself flat against the wall like ink drawn into plaster, and was gone. My hand passed through empty space and struck the banister. The solid knock echoed up the stairs. My breath shook free of my chest in sharp bursts that would not slow. The fifth night broke my certainty in a different way. I woke at 1:03 a.m. without choosing to. My eyes opened to the darkness of the bedroom, and I could not move a single part of my body. The ceiling pressed close as if it were inches from my face. My lungs worked, but none of my muscles would answer. From the hallway beyond my door, the light glowed faint and weak. The shadow stood there at the foot of the stairs, exactly where it always appeared. I tried to call out. My mouth opened, but no sound came. I remember thinking very calmly that this was what people meant when they talked about waking dreams. When control returned to my hands and feet, the figure was gone. The clock read P.E.0 in a.m. By the end of that week, I was no longer interested in proving myself right. I wanted answers, whatever they turned out to me see. During my lunch break at work, I pulled the house record from the county database and began to read an archive that stretched back more than 100 years. Ownership transfers, zoning disputes, long gaps where the house sat empty. Then I found the line that gave me pause. A police incident report from nearly 30 years ago, filed under the previous owner. The summary was brief and incomplete, but one phrase stood out like a loose thread. Multiple trespassing fatalities. Suspect deceased. I leaned back in my chair and felt the familiar weight of obsession settle into my chest. That night, when the clock crept toward 1 a.m. again, I did not watch the stairs with fear. I watched them with intent. The next morning, I took a sick day and drove into town with the restlessness of someone who had slept only in fragments. The county courthouse sat beside the river with pale stone walls and a flag that snapped in the wind like it was trying to break free. Inside, the records office smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner. The clerk at the counter squinted at my request and said, "That address again?" as if the farmhouse had a reputation even among filing cabinets. She handed me a thin folder tied with a faded string. I took it to a wooden table near the back and began to read. Trespassing cases, one after another, over a span of 6 years. Each described a person found dead of the property under different circumstances, but with a chilling consistency in the owner's statements. Subject perceived a non-human entity manifested in shadow form. Self-defense against an unknown threat. The coroner reports were blunt and unpoetic. Blunt force trauma. Broken neck. Severe head injury. I sat there feeling the weight of those words, imagining the landing at the top of my stairs not as a stage for a trick of light, but as a place where people once died. When I asked about the owner, the clerk hesitated before answering. "That was Harold Pike," she said. "He died in a fire shortly after the investigations closed." I asked about his family. She lowered her voice. "One son, Jacob. He was young when it all happened. They sent him away after the fire. Extended care facility. That is all I know." She pushed the folder back toward me like she was glad to be rid of it. Outside, I called Danny again and told her what I had found. The humor was gone from her voice this time. "You need to get out of that house," she said. "This is not a wiring problem." I told her I would consider it, which was a lie shaped like politeness. I was already driving to the public library. The librarian was an older woman with gray braids and an expression that suggested she had seen every kind of curiosity town residents could muster. When I mentioned the farmhouse, her smile thinned. "People do not ask about that place unless they have already seen something," she said. I nodded, unsure how much to reveal. She led me to a microfilm reader and helped me pull local newspapers from the years surrounding the deaths. The articles were sensational in a way only small-town headlines can be. Farmer claims demons on property. Deputies baffled by Pike defense. One image showed the staircase landing from the angle of the hallway. Even in grainy black and white, I recognized the shape of the light fixture and the narrow turn. The article quoted neighbors who said Harold had grown paranoid after his wife died. He believed shadows were not made by light but by entities that wore darkness like skin. I felt a tight pull behind my eyes as I read that phrase. When I asked about the son, the librarian paused and said, "That boy never recovered from those years. People say he learned to see the world the way his father described it." That night I did not wait in the living room. I climbed the stairs before midnight and sat on the edge of the landing itself, back against the wall where the shadow usually appeared. I wanted to confront the phenomenon on its own ground. At 58 a.m. my skin prickled with the sense of an approaching storm. The bulb above me hummed as if warming up for a performance. When my phone ticked over to 100, the light dimmed. At 102, the temperature seemed to dip just enough for me to notice. I held my breath without realizing it. At 103, the shadow formed inches from my face, rising from the wall like a figure stepping through a thin membrane. I could not make out any detail, but I knew it was shaped like a man, taller than me, broader at the shoulders. We were so close that I felt the idea of eye contact even though I could not see eyes. "You are not a demon," I whispered, uncertain why that felt like the right thing to say. It did not reply. At 10 said, it sank back into the wall, leaving only the faint buzz of the bulb behind. After that night my sleep grew ragged. I found myself waking at odd hours, sometimes frozen, sometimes mid-sentence, as if I had been talking in a dream and carried the words into waking. Once I woke with my right arm raised as though I had been reaching for the shadow in my sleep. The boundary between night and day thinned until I could not trust either. At work I caught myself staring at empty corners, waiting for a familiar outline to appear. Danny cornered me near the break room and said, "You look like you have not been home in weeks." I almost laughed. I had never been home more. I told her about the microfilm, about Harold Pike and his beliefs. She listened and said quietly, "Trauma spreads like a disease if you let it." I knew she was talking about the son as much as about me. On the 7th night after my discovery at the courthouse, the routine changed. I fell asleep on the couch around midnight and did not wake until the house made a soft creaking sound at 12:50 Thay. It was the sound of weight settling on old wood. My eyes snapped open and my heart began to race ahead of the minutes. I watched the clock. 1 Zachary Town 59. The bulb at the landing flickered. 1 Zachary Town. For the first time since all of this began, the shadow was already there. It did not arrive. It waited. I sat up slowly, every nerve alert. The figure seemed sharper than before, its outline more defined against the dim light. I said, "Why are you early?" The idea of speaking to it had become uncomfortably normal. It remained still, as it always did, but I had the dizzy impression that its attention had turned toward me rather than simply occupying the space. At 1:07 it dissolved as usual, yet the room did not feel empty afterward. The next day a knock came at my door just before dusk. A woman in her late 60s stood on the porch with a paper sack held tight against her chest. "I live down the road," she said. "I saw your light all at night. Thought I would bring you some bread." I thanked her, then hesitated before asking, "Do you know anything about the Pike family?" Her eyes flicked past my shoulder into the dark hallway where the stairs rose. "I know enough to tell you that place does not like to be watched," she said. I asked what she meant. She swallowed and said, "Harold used to sit for hours waiting for something he believed lived in the dark. His boy learned to sit with him." The bread felt heavy in my hands as she turned to leave. I asked about the son, Jacob. She paused at the edge of the porch and said, "Some people say he never stopped watching." That night I set up cameras in the hallway and on the landing. It felt like a small act of rebellion against something that had controlled my hours and my sleep. The feeds ran to my laptop on the kitchen table where I sat with a flashlight and a notebook. Midnight passed without incident. At 1:01 the bulb dimmed. At the Hawkerson 0A the shadow appeared on the screen with the same clean outline I had seen with my own eyes. I leaned closer to the monitor, heart pounding. The figure remained motionless, as always, yet this time a minor shift occurred that made my stomach tighten. The shadow's edge rippled slightly, as if something underneath the darkness had flexed. At 1:05 the figure vanished on screen just as it always did in person. I replayed the footage again and again until dawn found me still at the table, no closer to an answer, but certain at last that I was no longer dealing with an illusion alone. The footage lived on my laptop like a dare. I watched it in the mornings before work, at night before sleep, and sometimes in the quiet moments between inspections when my hands were idle and my mind wandered back to that shape on the landing. Each time I replayed it, the same question circled me. If it was not a trick of light, if it was not a waking dream bleeding across sleep, then what kind of physical thing could stand so still and leave no trace when it vanished? The ripple at the edge of the shadow haunted me the most. It was small, easy to dismiss if you wanted to, but I did not want to anymore. I slowed the footage to a crawl and studied frame by frame until my eyes burned. The ripple looked less like smoke and more like fabric under tension. I closed the laptop with a soft click and felt a new idea pressing in on me, one that made my skin prickle for reasons that had nothing to do with the dark. That day at work I could not focus. I misread an electrical panel and nearly failed to note a fractured beam in a crawl space because I was thinking about blackout cloth, stage curtains, and the way fabric moves when a person shifts their weight. Danny caught me staring at nothing outside the office and said, "You are somewhere else today." I told her about the ripple. Her face tightened. "You think it is a person," she said. I did not answer right away. Saying it out loud felt like inviting something to confirm the thought. "I think it could be," I said finally. She shook her head. "That is not better," she replied. "That means intent." We stood in silence for a moment. Then she said, "If someone is breaking into your house every night, you need the police." I told her about the old reports, about how the authorities had once written off deaths on that property as self-defense against imagined threats. She exhaled slowly. "That does not mean they would ignore you now," she said. I nodded, but a voice inside me whispered that calling for help before I understood the full shape of the threat might leave me with more questions than protection. When I got home that evening, the house felt different. The air inside held a faint scent I could not place at first. Not rot or metal or mold. Something sharper. Chemical. It hovered strongest near the bottom of the stairs, where I spent too much of my life waiting. I followed the smell up to the landing and realized it reminded me of cleaning solvent. I knelt and examined the wall where the shadow appeared. The paint was old and uneven, brushed on in thick strokes decades ago. I ran my fingers along the surface until they came away faintly gray. "You are messy," I said to the empty landing, my voice low and steady despite the nerves climbing my spine. That night I slept with a chair braced under my bedroom door, which did little to slow the knot of awareness coiled inside my chest. At 1:50 a.m. I rose and took my place behind the kitchen table with the laptop glowing before me. The cameras showed empty hallways and quiet corners. It did not appear all at once. It slid into place as if stepping into its own outline. My breath caught. For the first time since this began, the figure tilted its head. The movement was slight, hardly a gesture at all, but it carried intention I could no longer deny. "You can see me," I whispered, not sure why I addressed it in words rather than in motion. On the screen, the figure lifted one arm. The darkness bent at what could only be an elbow. At 1:0 said it did not vanish. It simply stepped back into the deeper dark at the top of the stairs where the camera could not follow. I moved before I could talk myself out of it. The hallway felt longer than ever before, my footfalls loud against the wood. The light above the landing buzzed with a low electric whine that set my teeth on edge. At the top, the darkness beyond the bend waited like an open mouth. "I am not afraid of shadows," I said, though fear pumped through my veins in quick, bright pulses. "If you are real, then stand where I can see you." Nothing answered. The house creaked around me with the ordinary sounds of age and cooling wood. I stood there longer than I cared to admit, staring into the turn of the hallway until my courage thinned into exhaustion. When I finally stepped back down, my legs trembled as if I had run a long distance. The next morning I found footprints in the dust near the back entrance. They were faint but unmistakably human. The impression showed tread and wear patterns consistent with boots worn by someone who favored their right foot. My chest tightened with a sharp twist of vindication and dread. I photographed the prints, measured their length, and noted their direction. They came from the tree line and returned the same way. Someone was coming to my house from the woods and leaving again without once touching a light switch. I took the photos to the local police station after work and laid them on the front desk with hands that would not quite keep still. The officer on duty studied them, then looked up at me with an expression that mixed concern and reserve. "You live out on Pike Road, correct?" he asked. I nodded. He pursed his lips. "We can send a patrol through," he said. "But if you are expecting prowlers, you may want to improve your exterior lighting." I told him about the shadow. He did not laugh, but his eyes held the distance of someone who has already made a decision. That evening, Danny drove out to the farmhouse with a bag of groceries and the stubborn loyalty of a friend who knows when someone should not be left alone. We ate on the back porch as the sun bled out of the sky in slow orange bands. I told her about the footprints. She listened without interrupting, then said, "Whatever is happening here, it is not confined to your head anymore." I nodded and watched the trees sway at the edge of the property. "If it is a person," I said, "they know my routines now. They know when I watch and when I sleep." Danny set her fork down. "Then stop playing observer," she said. "Set a line you control." I asked her what she meant. She tapped the porch rail with 2 fingers. "People trip," she said. "People make noise when they do, even in darkness." The idea settled over me like a cold sheet. It was simple and it was dangerous. It meant inviting the shadow closer rather than waiting for it to retreat. I told her I would think about it. That night, as I lay awake with the faint smell of solvent still lingering at the back of my throat, thinking was all I did. At 1:00 a.m., the shadow appeared again, upright and still. I did not rise from the couch this time. I watched through the camera feed as the figure stood where it always stood, a perfect theft of light. Yet now I knew what else to look for. The faint shift of weight, the tiny change in balance that no optical trick could truly fake. At 1:00, the ripple at the edge of the figure deepened into the suggestion of a shoulder moving beneath cloth. My pulse beat in my ears. "I see you," I said quietly to the empty kitchen. The figure did not move until 1:07, when it stepped backward into the unseen hall beyond the landing with the fluid economy of a human body that knew exactly where it was going. The day after Danny left, I began preparing the house as if it were a site inspection, with my life as the final report. I walked every room with a measuring tape and a notebook, noting distances, angles, blind spots, and the way sound carried through old wood. The farmhouse had the kind of layout that rewarded anyone who understood it. Long, straight hallways, narrow doorways, corners that forced a body to commit before it could turn. By late afternoon, my notebook had filled with loose sketches of the staircase and landing, layered with marks that only made sense to me. I was not building a trap in the dramatic sense. I was building a test. If the shadow was a person, as all evidence now suggested, then it obeyed gravity as surely as I did. I pulled a thin spool of clear monofilament line from my tool bag and weighed it in my hands. It was strong enough to hold weight, fine enough to be invisible in low light. I felt a strange calm settle into me as I pictured how it would stretch across the landing like a seam in the dark. Before night fell, I drove back into town for supplies I could not justify on any work order. Heavy-duty anchors, a small motion sensor alarm, a medical kit I hoped I would not need. At the hardware counter, the cashier scanned the items and raised an eyebrow. "Planning a renovation?" she asked. I smiled and said something like that. On the way home, I passed a cluster of mailboxes near the edge of Pike Road and slowed without quite meaning to. One box at the far end leaned at a tired angle. The name on it, half-faded and peeling, read J. Pike. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I told myself the county never removed boxes for families that moved away without forwarding addresses. Still, the sight of that name on the road felt like a message left where I could not avoid it. At sunset, I climbed into the attic with a flashlight and a crowbar and pried up sections of old insulation near the vent above the landing. The dust burned my sinuses and filled my mouth with the taste of age. Behind the insulation, I found shallow grooves carved into the wood beams. The marks were deliberate and repeated at regular intervals, almost like a crude ladder for hands and feet. Someone had used the structure of the house itself as a path. The idea of a body moving inside the walls while I slept made my stomach turn. I traced the grooves with my gloved fingers and followed them to a vent that led down into the hollow space beside the stairs. That night would not be the first time the shadow entered my home. It would only be the first time I was ready for it. By the time darkness settled in full, the house felt less like a refuge and more like a machine I had adjusted for a single narrow purpose. I anchored the monofilament on one side of the landing and ran it taut to a matching anchor on the opposite wall, setting it at a height that would catch just below the knee. The line vanished when I stepped back, even knowing exactly where it was. I tested the motion sensor and silenced it before its alert could sound, confirming that it would let me know the instant anything crossed its path. Then I waited. My heart did not race the way it had on earlier nights. Instead, a steady focus took hold. Whatever came would no longer be allowed to perform in isolation. If it appeared, it would have to move on my terms. At 1 a.m., the bulb above the landing dimmed as it always did. At 1 a.m., the shadow stood in place, tall and seamless against the yellow light. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the figure leaned forward. It was the first time it had ever done so. My breath caught as the edge of the shadow stretched toward the stairs below. The ripple at its outline deepened into unmistakable folds. Fabric. The darkness stepped into the arc of the monofilament. There was a sharp snap like a plucked string under sudden strain. The figure pitched forward with a sound that was not a whisper or a vanishing act, but the unmistakable impact of a human body striking wood. The thud echoed down the stairwell and into my bones. A raw cry broke the stillness. It was high, panicked, and very human. I reached the bottom of the stairs in 3 strides and froze. The shape at the landing had collapsed into a tangle of cloth and limbs. A boot kicked weakly against the banister. In the flickering light, I saw not a shadow but a man in black clothing layered head to toe, his face hidden behind a veil of dark fabric. He screamed again and clawed at his leg with trembling hands. "Do not look at me," he shouted. "Do not look at me." His voice cracked between terror and fury. My hands shook as I lifted the flashlight and directed its beam at him despite his plea. The light washed over his face and swept away the illusion in a brutal instant. He was younger than I expected, late 20s at most. His eyes were wide and glassy with unsorted fear. His right leg twisted at an angle that made my stomach clench. "It is over," I said, though I did not yet know if that was true. "You cannot hide in the dark now," he laughed in a thin, broken sound that did not belong to any humor. "You think it was the dark," he said. "You think it was the house." His gaze slid past me as if I were just another shape between him and something else. He taught me where to stand. He said the light would make me disappear if I did it right. I called the police with fingers that fumbled the numbers twice before I got them correct. As I waited for the dispatcher to answer, the man of the landing slumped back against the wall and began to rock slightly, murmuring words I could not quite make out. When the dispatcher asked me to describe the intruder, I said, "He is dressed like a shadow, and he is hurt." There was a pause of the line that felt very long. "Help is on the way," she said at last. While we waited, he spoke in fragments, as if pulled along by a tide that did not care whether he followed. He said his name was Jacob. He said the house was wrong with light because light told lies. He said his father had shown him how to see what other people could not. "They think it is just dark," he whispered. "They never watch long enough." I kept my distance, afraid that any sudden move might send him into another surge of panic or violence. The flashlight lay on the floor between us, its beam pointed up at the ceiling like a small, steady star. Sirens rose in the distance, growing louder by degrees rather than in a rush. When the doors burst open and the officers poured in, the machine I had built out of angles and tension and waiting finally released its hold on me. My knees buckled with the rush of relief I had denied myself until that moment. They carried him out on a stretcher with his legs strapped in place, black cloth and shattered certainty bundled together under bright emergency lights. One officer remained behind to take my statement while the paramedics worked in the driveway. I told him everything. The nightly appearances, the landing, the tripwire, the footprints. He listened without interrupting, his pen steady across the paper. When I finished, he said, "You did the right thing calling for help instead of trying to handle this alone any longer than you already had." I looked up the stairs at the now empty landing and nodded. A sour scent of sweat and solvent lingered where the shadow had fallen. "He has been practicing this for a long time," the officer said quietly. "We have had missing persons reports come and go in this county without answers. It looks like some of them may have ended here." The words landed with a slow and heavy certainty. As the police cars pulled away in the hour before dawn, I stood alone at the foot of the stairs and listened to the house settle back into itself. The bulb above the landing burned without flickering for the first time since I had moved in. The space where the shadow once stood looked smaller now, like just another patch of wall caught between angles of light. I should have felt triumph. Instead, a deeper fatigue spread through me, the kind that follows long vigilance rather than sudden fear. I knew the story of the farmhouse had not ended with the arrest. Truth rarely snaps shut that cleanly. But for the first time since I arrived, the night no longer felt like an appointment I was destined to keep. The days after Jacob's capture felt almost ordinary, but the farmhouse refused to release its hold. I woke at odd hours, half expecting the shadow to return despite the certainty that it could not. The smell of solvent lingered faintly in corners where the cleaning crew had swept, as if the house itself remembered the steps of someone who had moved through its dark passages. Danny visited several times, bringing coffee and the kind of company that was reassuring without needing explanation. She said little about the past week, only that the silence now was a relief. I agreed, though my eyes often drifted to the staircase, noting every angle, every shadow cast by the weak yellow bulb. It was almost peaceful. Almost. But something in the shape of the landing itself kept my thoughts taut. A week later, I returned to the courthouse to review Jacob's background. It was there I discovered a series of institutional record. Foster homes, therapy sessions, psychiatric evaluations. The notes painted a picture of a boy whose mind had been molded by fear and repetition. His father had drilled into him the belief that darkness could contain predators visible only to the careful, patient eye. Jacob had internalized it so completely that the nightly appearances in my landing had been a ritual, a continuation of a father's lessons. The psychological term repetition compulsion kept surfacing in the reports, but I read it as a cold description for something much more primal: terror, transmitted like an inheritance, a shadow passed from one generation to another. Returning home that evening, the farmhouse seemed smaller, as if it had exhaled after the drama. The stair landing no longer commanded my attention in the same way, though I walked past it with my usual caution. I traced the edges of the bulb above, examining the wall for cracks or marks, but only found the normal irregularities of old plaster. The monofilament anchors had been removed, and yet the memory of the trap remained vivid in my mind. I wondered how many nights I would remember the details, the precise way Jacob had pitched forward, the sound of fabric ripping against wire, and the raw fear in his voice. My hands itched to write it all down, to convert it from memory into something manageable, yet I resisted. Some stories, I realized, exist best as echoes rather than scripts. 2 weeks later, I received a call from the hospital. Jacob had fractured his leg badly but was recovering. He asked to see a psychologist immediately, expressing confusion over the intentions behind his actions. The attending physician told me that the son had begun acknowledging the consequences of his father's teachings. They were fragments of insight, but the first step toward recognition. I felt a cautious relief tempered by unease. Trauma, after all, does not vanish with a broken leg or police custody. It persists, shifts, and occasionally returns. The landing would always remind me of that, a silent witness to nights where I had faced more than mere shadows. In the quiet evenings, I began documenting the farmhouse for my own sake, not for work. I cataloged its creaks, its settling beams, its stubborn plumbing. I noted where light shifted and shadows pooled naturally, where reflections from the windows might trick a distracted eye. Each entry became a meditation, a way to reclaim the space from the memory of Jacob's performances. Danny stopped by one evening, reading over my notes. She chuckled softly at my meticulous sketches. "You are still treating it like a puzzle," she said. "Maybe you are not done with it yet." I smiled, not denying it. There was still a part of me that wanted certainty, a map of angles and shadows, a knowledge that the dark corners could no longer surprise me. The farmhouse, I realized, was as much a teacher as it had ever been, though now I could approach it with a sense of cautious mastery. One night, I heard a soft knock on the front door. Opening it, I found a neighbor I had barely met standing there, holding a small box of papers. "Thought these might interest you," he said, nodding toward the contents. Inside were old letters and photographs of the Pike family, including Harold and Jacob as a boy. The images captured mundane moments, a picnic by the river, Jacob swinging from a tree branch, Harold smiling. There were also darker images of the house under renovation decades earlier, shadows stretching in odd angles. I studied them for hours, noting the way darkness had been a constant presence in their lives. It was no longer a performance for me, a record of a legacy shaped by fear and precision. Finally, as I settled into the living room one night, I felt the house breathe around me, not with menace, but with the quiet of lived-in familiarity. The staircase landing no longer loomed as a stage. I could sit and watch the light scatter across the walls without flinching. Sleep came easier, and when I woke at odd hours, it was not from expectation of a shadow, but from the normal rhythms of an old house. Jacob's story, his father's terror, and the shadow he had enacted were all contained now by law, medicine, and distance. Still, I knew the farmhouse would always hold memory in the wood, the walls, the landing that had served as both stage and prison, and I knew that the next time someone passed through, it might demand attention again. Even in calm, I sometimes pause and glance at the stairs, half expecting the past to ripple forward. It does not. The house keeps its silence, the landing empty, and yet the echo remains. I realize now that fear is never truly gone, only transformed. What I faced was not darkness itself, but the way humans can shape it, perform it, and wield it in the name of belief. That knowledge is heavier than any shadow, more lasting than the fright it once inspired. In its weight I find a measure of quiet power, the power to watch, to understand, and to survive. Months passed after Jacob's capture, and the farmhouse settled into a rhythm that was more ordinary than I had ever dared hope. I moved freely through the hallways, unconcerned with the landing at the top of the stairs. The bulb above it burned steadily, and the shadows cast by furniture or window frames behaved as they should. Even the faint smell of solvent that had clung to the corners gradually faded. I could finally live in the house rather than coexisting with it in a constant state of alert. Yet despite this, I carried a cautious respect for the space. The landing, narrow and half-lit, retained a residual presence of what had occurred there. A silent reminder that fear, once nurtured, leaves traces. The police maintained regular contact about Jacob's condition. He was enrolled in intensive therapy and psychiatric care, beginning the long process of untangling the beliefs his father had instilled. From what I learned, Harold Pike's obsession had been a meticulous, horrifying education. Jacob had internalized the lessons, becoming both performer and predator, until the chain was broken by the tripwire in my preparation. Each report and update I received reminded me that trauma can be passed down, that fear can be a tangible inheritance. It made my vigilance feel necessary, not paranoid. I took to documenting every unusual sound, every creak, every flicker of light in the house, more as a study than as protection. Each note was a reaffirmation that the supernatural was not always supernatural, and that understand the human mind was sometimes more terrifying than the darkness itself. I shared parts of my notes with Danny during her visits, and she would shake her head with quiet amusement. "You've turned observation into an art form," she said. I agreed, but there was seriousness in my smile. Observation, patience, and preparation had saved me. They were the tools that distinguished survival from surrender. One evening, while reviewing the old photographs the neighbor had given me, I saw Jacob as a small boy, standing on the very landing that had become a stage for his nightly terror. His eyes were wide, curious, and unguarded. No darkness had yet been poured into them. I realized that the shadow I had confronted was never the darkness itself. It was a person, trained to become the darkness, to wield it against others. My hands shook slightly as I set the photographs down. For the first time, I understood how fragile perception can be when shaped by fear and repetition. And for the first time, I felt the landing belonged solely to me. Late at night, I would sometimes walk to the top of the stairs, placing a hand lightly on the railing, gazing at the spot where the shadow had always stood. It was empty, clean, ordinary. No ripple, no fold in the darkness, no lingering presence. I breathed in slowly, appreciating the mundane quiet that had finally returned. The house itself seemed content, finally able to exist without the nightly performance of fear. It was a testament to the idea that horror does not require ghosts. It requires belief, repetition, and a human willing to act as the instrument. The farmhouse, though now peaceful, continued to teach me patience and respect. The creaks and groans of old wood, the shifting light of the bulb, the occasional draft through the windows, all reminded me that vigilance was not about fear, but about awareness. What had been terror had become understanding. I had faced what I thought was supernatural, only to discover that human obsession can create shadows darker than any night. And in that realization, I found not terror, but mastery over the fear itself. Finally, I leaned against the railing one morning as the sun poured through the windows, the landing fully bathed in warm light. There was nothing there, only the ordinary textures of wood and plaster. The house had returned to its natural state, and so had I. Jacob was under care, the lessons of his father could not continue, and the staircase landing was no longer a stage. The shadow was gone, and the farmhouse breathed in quiet, ordinary peace. The knowledge of what had happened lingered, yes, but it no longer demanded fear. In the end, the darkness I had confronted was never supernatural. It was human. And surviving it had taught me more than any light could illuminate. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you'd like to support us, do hit that subscribe button and like this video. This really helps with our channel growth. So, see you tomorrow at the same time.